Well, what was taught to the apostles, we call that the apostolic gnosis. It was claimed to be known by later Gnostic churches, and we know that it existed, but we know that it didn't continue except in secret ways into the Gentile church institutions. And we know some of the ways it continued, for example, through the secret gospel of Mark. But it was transmitted orally. The New Testament was written by and for Gentiles or non-Jews. It reinforces the concepts and the assumptions of Hellenistic Greek religion. The New Testament Gospels were written as public writings to be read aloud. In fact, they were read as part of church year and festivals and things like this, as you have, for example, in the Johannine Gospel by the 2nd century. And they were exoteric. That means they were not esoteric. They were not part of the inner circle of things. They were part of the more evangelical aspect of the religion. They were the things that everyone who was baptized would hear, and even outsiders could come and hear, and so on. So the New Testament is an exoteric document. But there were inner circle teachings, or what we call the apostolic gnosis. We know because we even have sayings of Jesus saying that what I tell you, I speak to everybody outside in parables, but I tell you plainly. Or he says, do not throw your pearls to the swine. Or he says other things that indicate that he's giving them certain kinds of knowledge and things like this that must not be shared with those who are not part of this, because if you throw your pearls to the swine, they will turn and rend you. And it's not a pretty thing to think of people outside the circle or outside of this as swine, but it's not because Jesus was thinking in human beings as swine. It's because in Hebrew and in Aramaic, people use these very strong contrasts to get ideas across. And so, for example, he talks about things like somebody has a speck in his eye and somebody else has a log in his eye. These are big overblown kinds of things, and that's the way Hebrew expresses itself. So Jesus says, do not share your pearls with the swine lest they turn and rend you. That means they will make fun of you and ridicule you and so on for the things you say. So there was an inner circle kind of teaching that was given to the apostles and those who shared the meal with him. It was exclusively oral in transmission. Paul, for example, everything Paul learned in Damascus, once he had been taken to Damascus and came into the care of Christian masters who healed his blindness, etc., everything he learned was oral. And that's how this was transmitted. And in fact, this is what Paul was given for 14 years before he became the wandering apostle. Now we have some papyrus fragments like the Gospel of the Hebrews or of the Egyptians or some of the Ebionites and different things that preserve little bits and fragments of some of the inner teaching. But the inner teaching was not written down, and when it was written down, as it was in secret Mark, people were not to give it out anywhere. It was not to be copied by normal scribes. If anyone got a hold of a copy, it was to be denied, as you will learn as we look at secret Mark later and so on. One of the places where we really have what seem to be inner circle teachings or apostolic gnosis is in the Gospel of Thomas. We have what seem to be authentic logia and mashalim parables of the Master Jesus, and they are as early as the Q source. And although they've been Gnosticized and a lot of spin has been put on and a lot of vocabulary, still we seem to have some very early inner circle material there. We also have the Gospel of Mary, which tells us about things that may relate to the initiations into the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven that are spoken of, and the secret Gospel of Mark, which describes the initiation of a young man all night long on a mountain into the mysteries of the kingdom. The mysteries are the ratzim, and the mysteries of heaven, which are spoken about in Daniel's vision of the Bar Enosh, the Son of Man, coming on the clouds of heaven. The same word is used, ratzim, for clouds. The cloaks, the clouded things, the things that obscure your vision. And the ratzim are mysteries of the Malkuth, which is the kingdom of God, meaning the sovereign presence of God. The ratzim of the Malkuth, the mysteries of the kingdom of God or the kingdom of heaven, these are the inner teachings, and the explanation of these mysteries are part of the inner teachings. And then the actual experience of these mysteries, which seems to have been transmitted by Yeshua, are the mysteries. This all is esoteric. This is stuff that's not transmitted and written about in books that are published and that are copied by scribes, although we do have some written material that later on surfaces, but certainly not at the beginning. Now, this material is in the company of a whole lot of other material that is not authentic. All kinds of claims to apostolic gnosis, all kinds of claims to the gnosis of Jesus by the 2nd and 3rd century Gnostics, who have Jesus delivering all kinds of discourses from his resurrected body and so on. But this material I've spoken of that comes from the Gospel of Thomas, Secret Mark, and Gospel of Mary, and a few other fragments, are the things that I consider to be authentic artifacts of the apostolic gnosis, the inner circle teachings of Jesus and the practices. So the most important literary source we still have is the Gospel of Thomas. We have other lost Jewish Gospels, like the Gospel of the Hebrews. We even have a Hebrew version of the Gospel of Matthew that was recovered by a Christian bishop from after a pogrom on a Jewish shtetl in the medieval period, and it seems to be very ancient, and it's now available. You can find it online and so on. And I'm not quite sure what the connections are of that with the very early, with anything very early Jewish and Messianic Christianity, but it's still interesting. But what we do have are these fragments of lost Gospels and things like the Gospel of the Hebrews. But what we have that is most important are all the logia and mashalim of Jesus from the Gospel of Thomas. And the Gospel of Thomas is almost a cult thing. People love it so much because there's so much in it. It's difficult to interpret. It's difficult to translate because it comes to us in Coptic. We have some versions in Greek that appear in some earlier manuscripts that we had found, I think, in Oxyrhynchus. But the total Gospel of Thomas was discovered in the Nag Hammadi Coptic Gnostic Library at Canabaskian in Egypt after World War II, and it's written in Coptic. Now, Thomas is represented in the New Testament literature, mainly in the Johannine literature, as the unbelieving apostle. He couldn't believe that Jesus had really been resurrected. In fact, he was such an unbeliever that he had to actually stick his hand in the wound of Jesus in order to be convinced of the truth of the resurrection of Jesus. Now, I want you to get used to something. Get used to the idea that whether the traditions come from Peter or from John or from any of the apostles, they don't come exactly from those people. They come from their disciples, and their disciples are in competition. The disciples of Peter are in the competition with the disciples of John. My master was the great apostle. No, my master was a great apostle. So the disciples of Thomas, who are represented by the viewpoint of the Gospel of Thomas, consider Thomas to be the great apostle and the twin of Jesus. And the disciples of John, or the beloved disciple, or possibly Mary Magdalene, consider him or her to be the beloved disciple. And the disciples of Peter consider him to be the rock upon which the church will be built. He's the great disciple. And then the Jewish apostles of James considered him to be the great saint next to Jesus, etc. Well, the stories that we hear, therefore, in the Johannine gospel about how how John told these stories that Thomas, the apostle Thomas, was the one who was the doubter, the doubting Thomas, and he had to actually stick his finger into the wounds of Jesus, was meant to discredit the followers of Thomas, because only John's way was the right way, and that's the way it always works out in all these disciplic traditions. But I want you to understand, no, get rid of that idea. Just because you read somewhere in the New Testament that somebody isn't the best or the right person or something, simply means you've got a bias there. For example, probably one of the greatest disciples of the early period was Mary Magdalene. She was completely X'd out of the situation by the male church authorities that were jealous of her, one of whom was Peter, strongly jealous. So Thomas, get to appreciate Thomas. Thomas comes to us in later traditions as an ascetic who is sent to India by Jesus, and he preaches against marriage and all these things, but he's still honored as a great saint in India. He was undoubtedly an ascetic. Whether he was anti-marriage and all this, we don't know. But he was a great disciple of Jesus, and he was part of the inner circle of Jesus. So get used to this. Thomas, a great disciple. And this that we have of the traditions of the Apostle Thomas, very early material of the Logia that we find in the Gospel of Thomas, is really important material to learn how to use and to understand if we want to get a little closer to the inner circle teachings of Mar Yeshua. Now, I'm going to read you some examples. If you're familiar, I hope you are by now, with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John and what you have in the New Testament. I'm going to read you some of the Logia that we find that are in both the document Q, and which pre-existed Matthew and Luke, and in the Gospel of Thomas. And they're in the same form that document, which we don't have anymore, would have put them, as just a list of different kinds of sayings. So I'm going to read you some of these things from the Gospel of Thomas you will find to be very familiar. We're going to look at Logian number 9, the parable of the sower. From the Gospel of Thomas. Jesus said, "See, the sower went out. He filled his hand. He threw. Some seeds fell on the road. The birds came, they gathered them. Others fell on the rock and did not strike root in the earth and did not produce ears. And others fell on the thorns. They choked the seed, and the worm ate them. And others fell on the good earth, and it brought forth good fruit. It bore 60 per measure and 120 per measure." Now, where have we heard that before? Well, it's in Mark, and you'll find it in some of the very earliest stuff that we have from the New Testament. Let's look at the parable of the mustard seed as it appears in the Gospel of Thomas. The disciples said to Jesus, "Tell us what the kingdom of heaven is like." He said to them, "It is like a mustard seed, smaller than all seeds, but when it falls on the tilled earth, it produces a large branch and becomes shelter for the birds of the heaven." Very familiar from the Synoptic Gospels and from Mark. Let's read the parable or the story about the prophet who is unacceptable in his own home. This is undoubtedly a historical event. When Jesus returned to his own village of Nazareth, he was highly rejected. Possibly even people tried to stone him. Jesus said, "No prophet is acceptable in his village. No physician heals those who know him." Again, Gospel of Thomas. It's all written in Aramaic idioms translated into Greek and then into Coptic. It's idiomatically very interesting. Here's another one. Jesus said, a city being built on a high mountain and fortified cannot fall, nor can it be hidden. Jesus said, what shalt thou hear in thy ear, and the other ear that preach from your housetops? For no one lights a lamp and puts it under a bushel, nor does he put it in a hidden place, but he sets it on a lampstand, so that all who come in and go out may see its light. Jesus said, if a blind man leads a blind man, both of them fall into a pit. Jesus said, it is not possible for one to enter the house of the strong man and take him by force unless he bind his hands. Then he will ransack his house. So we can go on and read these sayings of Jesus. Jesus said, take no thought from morning until evening, and from evening till morning for what you shall put on. We find this explained in another way in this story of not having anxiety, because God dresses the birds of the air and so on, which, by the way, is a story we find in Epictetus and earlier, and may have been known to those who told this parable. But all these are things we find in the New Testament, but we find them here in earlier versions and what seem to be more authentic versions. There are many, many others that we could talk about. Now let's look, however, at the unfamiliar logia, the ones that have that are what we might think of as Gnostic and Kabbalistic. Now you have to be very careful with this, because you're going to find some Gnostic technical language and things like this, but the concepts are things that fit very nicely with the kind of Jewish mysticism that Jesus was imbued with. This is Logion number 2 of the Gospel of Thomas. Jesus said, let him who seeks not cease seeking until he finds, and when he finds, he will be troubled. And when he has been troubled, he will marvel, and he will reign over the all. Now, this has got some Gnostic language. The all, tapon, is a term that's used very often in Gnosticism, but it's used in other senses too. For example, in Kabbalistic and in Hebrew thought. So this is a very interesting thing. He's telling you that you need to keep on seeking, like it says in the New Testament, keep on seeking and you will find, keep on knocking. And the idiom is not just seek and you will find, it's keep on seeking and you will find, keep on knocking and it will be opened unto you, and so on. But here he says, let him who seeks not cease seeking until he finds. And that's exactly what the Hebrew idiom was. And when he finds, he will be troubled. And that refers to the experience of the wise man when he is tested by wisdom. And when he's been troubled, after that, he will marvel and he will reign over the all. He will rule. And there's many places, and there's some places in the New Testament talk about the Malkuth, or the part of the Malkuth, or the reign of God, that belongs to those who overcome among the disciples, who, in one of the parables, after the return of the landowner, he rewards the faithful ones by giving them different nations to rule over, and this will rule over 3 kingdoms, and you will rule over 5 kingdoms, and so on. The idea of reigning and ruling and having part in the sovereignty of God. It's a concept of that has been expressed sometimes as working with God in his creation. Bishop Barbara Marks Hubbard referred to this as one who became a co-creator with God. One reigned with God in the reign of God, in the Malkuth of God. Now we have another logion that is interesting to look at. Logion number 3 of the Gospel of Thomas. Jesus said, if those who lead you, that means to influence you, say to you, see, the kingdom is in heaven, then the birds of heaven will precede you. If they say to you, it is in the sea, as, by the way, some of the concepts of the coming Messiah were he was the man of the sea who would come out of the sea. If they say to you, it is in the sea, then the fish will precede you. He's being hyperbolic here. He's saying that the kingdom is not on the sea, it's not in the heaven, and so on. But the kingdom is within you, and it is without you. Remember how Jesus says that in Greek, in the in the Gospels, he says to the Pharisees who are baiting him about this, he says, the kingdom of heaven is within, inside, entos, you. And so in this saying, he says, if the kingdom is within you and it is without you, if you will know yourselves, then you will be known, and you will know that you are the sons of the living Father. But if you do not know yourselves, then you are in poverty, and you are poverty. Now, this last bit may be a Gnostic interpolation or addition, because to the Gnostic, the Hellenistic Gnostics, the most important thing was belief. It was knowing this. If you just know these things, then you have the knowledge that is the key to this, and then you have salvation by just knowing and by believing. So in my sense, I would not think that if you will know yourselves, then you'll be known, and you will know that you are the sons of the living Father, etc. I think it relates to historical teachings of Jesus, but I think this has been Gnosticized to kind of put through this concept. And now we have a very Kabbalistic statement coming from Jesus talking about the trees of paradise, of the Pardais. This is Logian number 19. Jesus said, "Blessed is he who was before he came into being." Blessed is he who was before he came into being. If you become disciples to me and hear my words, these stones will minister to you. And now he gives us this wonderful little statement that is a Kabbalistic statement. He says, "For you have 5 trees in paradise," and in Hebrew that would be pardes, "which are unmoved in summer or in winter, and their leaves do not fall. Whoever knows them will not taste death." Now, this idea of the 5 trees in paradise is very different than what you're used to, the 2 trees, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and the tree of life. This is 5 trees, and what does this mean? It's very interesting. In John's Gospel, when Jesus heals the blind man and he asks him what he can see, the blind man says, "I see men as trees walking." Well, the five branches or limbs, the five branch star, which represents the human being, the 2 arms, the 2 legs, and the head, is correlated in the earlier forms of Kabbalah to the form of the image of God, the divine image. And they're eternal. These trees are unmoved. And they are like the Sephirot, except it's a different expression of how it's done. Anyway, this indicates a very early form of Kabbalistic thought that we find, and definitely something that has nothing to do with Hellenistic Gnosticism, Hellenistic Gnosis, but with early Jewish mystic thought. Here is one I like very much. This is the 29th Logian. Jesus said, "If the flesh has come into existence because of the Spirit, it is a marvel. But if the Spirit has come into existence because of the body, it is a marvel of marvels." Well, what would Jesus think? Of course, the flesh came into existence because of the Spirit, not the other way around. "But I marvel at how this great wealth," meaning the Spirit, "has made its home in this poverty." And we have a couple more logia along these lines I'm going to read that seem to me to be very early and very authentic and represent something of the apostolic gnosis. Logian number 22. Jesus saw children who were being suckled. He said to his disciples, "These children who are being suckled are like those who enter the kingdom." They said to him, "Shall we then, being children, enter the kingdom?" And Jesus said to them, "When you make the two one, and when you make the inner as the outer, and the outer as the inner, and the above as the below, and when you make the male and the female into a single one, so that the male will not be male and the female will not be female," and then we have another line here which I believe is incorrect. It says, And when you make eyes in the place of an eye, I think it should say when you make an eye in the place of eyes, and a hand in the place of hands, and a foot in the place of feet, and an image in the place of an image. This, I think, is a Gnostic expansion upon the basic idea that he said, then shall you enter the kingdom. Now, this idea that those who were resurrected, those who were worthy of the Kema, the resurrection, when Jesus is asked about the woman with 7 husbands and whose wife she will be and so on, he says that before they are not like human beings, they are neither male nor female, but they are like the angels. They are androgynous. They are both male and female. They are both this way. This idea of this kind of integration of the masculine and the feminine and the change from duality into a monism that goes from the human state, which is dualistic and duality, into the monistic divine state. This is a concept that we will find in Judaism and in esoteric Judaism. And in the case of Jesus, we find other evidences of this sort of thing in his teaching. You don't find this in Gnosticism anywhere else. So I think this is quite authentic. We have another one I'd like to read you. This is Logian 37. His disciples said, when wilt thou be revealed to us, and when will we see thee? And Jesus said, when you take off your clothing without being ashamed, and take off your clothes and put them under your feet as the little children, and tread on them, then shall you behold the Son of the Living One, and you shall not fear. Now, does this mean we all need to get naked? No. I know a lot of people who like the Gospel of Thomas think that's what it means, but it could be interpreted a lot of ways. It could mean when we go back to nature, when we do this. But what it really means, what this is really about, is the removing of the garments. There's some other stories that are told about you giving your clothes back to someone in a field and being naked and so on. This refers to leaving the body behind. It refers to death. It refers to the state after death, which one can also enter into while you are in the body through mystical practices. So he says, when you take off your clothing without being ashamed, and take your clothes and put them under your feet as little children and tread on them, that refers to your outer garments, refer to your body. When you leave behind your body, when you lay it aside, and that can be in death or it can be through experiences before death, then you will behold the Son of the Living One, and you shall not fear. And this is a very interesting teaching, because it's basically saying that the Son of the Living One now is not Jesus who is talking. There's another concept here, and that would be probably the Bar Enosh. That would be probably the Son of Humanity, the Son of God, or something like that. And that vision that we see, which is couched in the frame of the post-resurrection appearances of Jesus, because they say, when wilt thou be revealed to us? Well, who and what Jesus is, that's what they are. In the Gospel of Thomas, it's said over and over again that they are what he is, and when they get to that point, they become what he is. So this is a mystical statement that that true union and true vision takes place out of the body, not in the body, and that can be done through certain practices, but it also happens after death. Now, if this is an authentic Logian, which I think it is, then I think that the mysteries of the kingdom of God involved having experiences of the divine world that were invisible to us, and that's why Moses and Elijah appeared to the disciples on the Mount of Transfiguration, etc., and there was a mystic communion between all living beings in this eon and other eons, or this olam and the other olam, etc. But anyway, we have a teaching here that is very allegorized, and it's been passed down and Gnosticized, but that I think gives us an insight into some very authentic teachings of Jesus. Now, how are we going to separate what's authentic from the Gnostic spin in all these things? Well, there is Gnostic jargon that's used, like the all, and talks about the image and the likeness and gnosis and the living one and things like this. We can recognize these things as Gnostic terms and Gnostic jargons or post-resurrection Gnostic Christian ideas. There is also some very strong evidence of Gnostic anti-Semitism. I'm going to read you one thing. This is from Logian 43. His disciples said to him, "Who art thou that thou shouldst say these things to us?" And Jesus said to them, "From what I say to you, you do not know who I am, but you have become as the Jews, for they love the tree, they hate its fruit, and they love the fruit, they hate the tree." Now, this is an anti-Semitic statement, not something that Jesus would have said, but something that Christians much later would have said, especially after the split with the Jewish Christians or the Jewish Messianic Jews and so on. He could have said something negative about, of course, the temple establishment or something like that, but this is not the kind of statement that would be made. So we can take a look at something like that and say, oh yeah, this is not historical. And then sometimes there are indications of later issues in the Logia. For example, in Logian 16, later church issues. Logian 16, I'll read to you. Jesus said, "Men possibly think that I have come to throw peace upon the world, and they do not know that I have come to throw divisions upon the earth, fire, sword, war. For there shall be 5 in a house, 3 shall be against 2, and 2 against 3, the father against the son against the father, and they will stand as solitaries," monachos. Now, this is not the kind of preaching and teaching that Jesus was doing, although his teaching was divisive. But Jesus did not act as a divider. He did not act as a person who tried to divide families and do things like this sort of thing. This, in fact, is a later time in church history when, in perhaps Jewish Messianic history, when in one Jewish family there would be some who were Messianic and some who were not, and this sort of thing. It may be pre-Gentile Christian in terms of the issue, but the issue that comes up is not one from the ministry of Jesus, but that occurs after the ministry of Jesus. So there are indications like these sometimes of later images. So we can use this to separate authentic logia from Gnostic or other kinds of spin. But the importance, and this is the whole deal of the importance of the Gospel of Thomas, is a great study. There's way more to it than this. It's worth a whole seminar if we were going to go into it deeply, but it contains early authentic material that's reworked into a Gnostic frame, but demonstrating mystical realized eschatology rather than the kind of apocalyptic that we find in the early Gentile churches and the later Jewish Messianic movement. And it seems to represent esoteric inner circle mystic teachings of Mar Yeshua. And this is a very important document. It's an important one to look through and to understand and to use some careful discrimination in understanding what's said. Now I'm going to read some of the logia of the Gospel of Thomas, just because they're very beautiful. And what I'm going to do is put a little a painting that's been inspired by each logia. And this was on a website several years ago, a beautiful website that of paintings that were done. I do not have the reference for it, and I've not been able to find it ever since. I've searched through Google Images and things, so I cannot give credit to the painter. But these are people who were devoted to the Gospel of Thomas and who were inspired by the different logia. So I'm going to read a logia and show the painting that it inspired by in some people. This is Logion 49. Jesus said, "Blessed are the solitary and elect, for you shall find the kingdom, because you come from it, and you shall go there again." Now here, the solitary and the elect. The word, the solitary are the monachos, the monks, those who are by themselves. Now, Jesus was not necessarily an advocate of monasticism, as he later became to some segments of Christianity. He did speak about the validity of some make themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven and all this sort of thing. But he didn't push the whole ascetic thing or non-marriage thing at all in the way that, for example, we find in the traditions of Thomas. So this is definitely something that I would say is part of the later Thomas tradition, not the teachings of Jesus. In fact, the word elect is a word that comes up later in the Christian church. It means those who self-elect to choose this way. So this is not an authentic logion, but it gives you some idea of the flavor of the traditions of Thomas, which were very ascetic. Logion 50. Jesus said, "If they say to you, 'From where have you originated?' say to them, 'We have come from the light, where the light has originated through itself. It stood and it revealed itself in their image.' If they say to you, 'Who are you?' say, 'We are his sons, and we are the elect of the living Father.' If they ask you, 'What is the sign of your Father in you?' say to them, 'It is a movement and a rest,' anaposis. Anaposis is a very important term you find in Gnosticism. These are Gnostic sayings I'm reading you. The Gnostic religion was a very philosophical religion, but in this particular case, the Gnostic traditions associated with the later Thomas traditions are very much like Pythagorean traditions in some ways, and they become very, very much like the Eastern traditions that you find in India, the Buddhist traditions and various ascetic traditions. This is Logion 56. Jesus said, "Whoever has known the world," and the word here is cosmos, "has found a corpse. And whoever has found a corpse, of him the world is not worthy." Now, this indeed may be an authentic saying of Jesus. We find in the Johannine Gospel and other kinds of places that Jesus considers the word cosmos in Greek doesn't translate a word that means the earth and the fullness thereof. It means the world, and specifically the outer world and the world that has been polluted and controlled and made impure by the impure actions and motivations of human beings. For example, in John's Gospel, we find already language like this, that Jesus knew what was in man, and that doesn't mean something good, by the way, and all this sort of thing. So how authentic this might be, I'm not sure, but one of the sayings I like very much from the Gospel of Thomas, which may or may not be authentic, Jesus said, it's the shortest one you'll ever find, it said, Jesus said, "Become passers-by." Don't get attached to the world. Don't get attached to riches. Don't get attached to wealth. that's very much in line with a lot of the teachings we find in the New Testament. That attachment to worldly goods is a disaster. In fact, the whole issue of poverty was a tough one for the early church. The Ebionites took it very literally. Just don't have attachments. Don't even have a home. Don't have this. Don't have that. And so this kind of thing, whoever has found the world, the cosmos, has found a corpse, and whoever has found a corpse, of him the world is not worthy. This idea that there is a spiritual world that is the great and the beautiful and the true and the luminous world, and that we can't see it because we are living in a lower world that's ruled by lower negative forces, is an idea that that we can't just totally disassociate from Jesus, even though it seems very Gnostic. Logian 63. Jesus said, there was a rich man who had much money. He said, I will use my money that I may sow and reap and plant and fill my storehouses with fruit so that I lack nothing. This is what he thought in his heart, and that night he died. Whosoever has ears to hear, let him hear. Now, this is definitely very close to an authentic Logian of Jesus that we have from his teaching from many other sources. And the idea that putting your trust in worldly goods and in the outer world and in wealth and all these kinds of things is a very bad idea, because those things are not permanent and you cannot depend upon those things. Instead, put your trust in the things that are of God. And so this indeed sounds like it might have been not really an esoteric teaching, but a teaching that Jesus perhaps expanded upon. Logian 67. Jesus said, whoever knows the all but fails to know himself lacks everything. The all is another word for the cosmos, the world. And this is something that probably is rooted in a teaching of Jesus. We find Jesus speaking about the importance of this, for example, the idea of your individual soul, suke. Of course, there are many words that he could have been using here besides suke. And again, we find this in Johannine teaching, which is related to what we find in Asia Minor and a later sort of ascetifying tradition that's going to eventually leave its roots in Greek Orthodox stuff and so on. But where in Johannine tradition, Jesus says, what good is it to gain the whole world and lose your soul? And basically, we have a sentiment like that here. Whoever knows the all but fails to know himself lacks everything, but it's phrased in terms of knowing, and it's a Gnostic kind of way of looking at the same thing. Here's Logian 108. Jesus said, whoever drinks from my mouth shall become as I am, and I myself will become he, and the hidden things shall be revealed to him. And to drink from my mouth can refer to several interesting things. It means to listen to and digest and inwardly digest and feed upon his words, the teachings that he gives. It also may refer to the holy kiss that is given in some of the earliest mystical Christian traditions. And whether this is something that we should say is a is an esoteric tradition of Jesus or not, we don't know, but it represents something that certainly was part of early mystic tradition. I'd like to read you a few more from the Gospel of Thomas. We've looked at some things that were Gnostic. We've looked at some things that seem to have authentic roots. These are some interesting ones. The first one I want to read you is, in this kind of category, is Logian 7, because it's instruction that Jesus gives to his disciples about controlling the passions and controlling the inner nature, and his mechanism for doing so was sublimation. Here's what it says. Jesus said, "Blessed is the lion which the man eats, and the lion will become man, and cursed is the man whom the lion eats, and the lion will become man." Well, what does that mean? Well, Jesus spoke very often this way, and this is the way that a whole teaching, which he explained, might have been started with something like this, which people didn't understand. Now, we don't have the explanation of the teaching here, but I'm going to give you what I think is the explanation. But we do have the little seed kernel that remembers the teaching. And what I think is being said here, when he says, "Blessed is the lion which the man eats, and the lion becomes man," the lion represents always in Hebrew mysticism a negative force. Very often it's Satan as a roaring lion, or it can be anger that people have, and so on. When anger, later on among the Egyptian desert fathers and mothers, they spoke of when anger rises up as high as the throat, one sublimates it and puts it back down again. So when Jesus said, "Blessed is the lion which the man eats, and the lion will become man," Jesus is saying, I believe, that anger or other negative things rise up in your throat or in your heart for you to do or say something evil. Then you control it by swallowing it. You sublimate it. You do not allow it to express. Now, this is not anything other than sublimation. This is not a suppression of feeling or emotion. You know what you're feeling, but knowing what you're feeling, you choose to suppress it, and that's eating the lion. And then the lion becomes man. The lion becomes human. You've turned that force into a positive force. But, he says, "Cursed is the man whom the lion eats, and the lion will become man." And that means that if you allow those forces to be expressed through actions, through words, through plans that you make, etc. In other words, if you take your bad motives, the impulses of the evil Keizer, and you allow them to go forward and fulfill, then the lion eats the man. Then you become that. A very interesting thing in the Gospel of Mark, and then the Markan source, when Jesus is about to go into Jerusalem, supposedly that Peter, when Jesus asks, "Who do men say that I am?" and people say different things, and Peter replies that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, which of course is a later Christian creedal statement. And Jesus says, "Be silent, don't tell this to anybody." This is the messianic secret, of course, of Reed. He says that flesh and blood could not have revealed it to you. That must have been revealed to you by God. And immediately afterward, when Jesus says he has to go into Jerusalem, Peter tries to stop him from going, and then Jesus turns around and says, "Get thee behind me, Satan." Suddenly, Peter has turned in just a split second from being the inspired one who knows the Word of God to one who is under the control and power of Satan. And how does that happen? Well, this is how it happens. Either you eat the lion or the lion eats you. And this is a process that goes on in people's discipleship, in their attempts to purify themselves and go through, uh, uh, start down deep with their motives and their intentions, and to analyze them and not let them just come to the surface without some kind of real vetting. Now we have the story that we find in Mark of the Jesus when he's healing in around the Capernaum and those areas, that his mother and his brothers come and they stand out the house where he's in teaching, and they think he's crazy. They think he's nuts, and people come and ask him and tell him his mother and brothers are outside. We know these conflicts occurred because we have things like this. This is, of course, quickly glossed over. You don't find this in Luke and Matthew, where we've got the Holy Family and the Virgin Mary and all this. But here, this is probably a remembrance of some real original conflicts that were going on between Jesus and his family when he started out in his ministry. So this is told in Mark, and it's also told in Thomas, and Thomas tells the story this way. The disciples said to him, "Thy brethren and thy mother are standing outside." He said to them, "Those here who do the will of my Father, they are my brethren and my mother. These are they who shall enter the kingdom of my Father." So this is exactly what we find in Mark's gospel. That's another thing that makes a lot of people think that this is very early authentic material. You see, in later Gentile Christianity, the whole business of the Holy Family and all this kind of thing took precedence over any kind of negative information that there would have been. Now here's one that's interesting. In the 19th century, Walt Whitman wrote, I don't know if it was in Leaves of Grass or of his other poetry, a line that is very similar to what we find in the Gospel of Thomas, but way before this had ever been discovered. So I'm going to read you that line. It's very beautiful. Jesus said, and this is from Logian 77, "Cleave a piece of wood, I am there. Lift up the stone, and you will find me there." Now, the only place in all literature that ever appears is in the Gospel of Thomas and whatever its sources are, and in Walt Whitman. Now, I don't know whether I would say that this goes back to historical Logian of Jesus. I don't know, but I think it's very interesting that we have this this interesting situation where Whitman comes up with this kind of a phrase long before this is ever discovered. Now here is a teaching about John the Baptist. Now you have to remember that this teaching could only have been given at a time when John the Baptist was held to be the highest of and greatest of all the prophets. And that would have been very early on in the actual career of Jesus, not later on among the early Gentile Christian churches. They didn't care a whit about John the Baptist then, and John the Baptist's fame was not that important to them at that time. But here, in Gospel of Thomas, we find a teaching of Jesus that assumes and presumes that John the Baptist is really highly thought of by everybody, which he was at the time of Jesus. Jesus was not at all as famous as John the Baptist. If anyone had thought they were a Messiah, it would have been John the Baptist, certainly not Jesus. So this is Logian 46. Jesus said, "From Adam until John the Baptist, there is among those who are born of women none higher than John the Baptist, so that his eyes will not be broken," which, by the way, is a very classic Hebrew statement of that his fame can never be modified, and that's very Semitic. "But I have said that whoever among you becomes as a child shall know the kingdom, and he shall become higher than John." And that is probably a historical teaching of Jesus. I would be willing to bet on that, because it could only come from the time of Jesus' ministry, and instead of making Jesus greater than John the Baptist, it makes anyone who enters the kingdom, the Malkuth of heaven, greater than even John. And this is a very, very important concept. Now here's something else that is very interesting about this gospel. You know that the Gospel of Thomas is organized under the ascetic Gnostic Thomas traditions, which developed a century or so after, or 2 centuries after the actual historical Thomas. But we find, and then in Thomas's Gospel, in all the spin of Thomas's Gospel, we find stuff about how Thomas is the greatest disciple and he's the twin of Jesus and blah, blah, blah. But we find also we have a Logian 12, that tells us something quite different, and it's embedded right in the middle of this. It says, the disciples said to Jesus, "We know that thou wilt go away from us. Who is it who shall be great over us?" And Jesus said to them, "Wherever you have come, you will go to James the righteous," James the just, the brother of Jesus, James the just, "for whose sake heaven and earth came into being." Well, that's a pretty high statement. And we do think that James the just, as he was called, was the physical brother of Jesus, that this rift between Jesus and his mother and his brothers was very quickly healed, that he had at least one brother who became very close with Jesus, perhaps not even as a disciple, but as an associate, because James was considered to be very great and priestly man. And according to what we read, after the resurrection of Jesus, James the Just was considered to be such a holy man. He was very ascetic. He had big husks on his knees from all of his praying and everything, that he actually acted the role and was demanded by the people to act the role of a high priest, which must have meant he had a priestly lineage, as Jesus did, during the Day of Atonement, when the appointed high priest, the politically appointed high priest, instead of him going in and giving atonement for the people, actually James the Just himself was the one who went into the Holy of Holies and pronounced the sacred word of God and did this. And for that he was finally thrown off of the temple and killed by the temple establishment. Even though it was demanded by the people, they dared not have him do it because he was considered to be such a holy man and such a prophet. So when in this gospel we find that Jesus says, "Go to James the righteous, James the just, for whose sake heaven and earth came into being," that's a pretty high statement. Now there's one more thing I want to point out. There's the study of this gospel is a very, very, very long thing, and we're just taking a peekaboo at it. But at the very end, the final Logion 1:14, Simon Peter said to them, "Let Mary go out from among us, because women are not worthy of the life." Now this, by the way, reflects something we find in a lot of early Christian literature, that Peter felt very competitive with Mary Magdalene, and he, in many situations, he's shown trying to marginalize her and minimize her importance. She is obviously closer to Jesus, was closer to Jesus than he was. And so here Simon Peter said to them, "Let Mary go out from among us, because women are not worthy of the life." And Jesus said, "See, I shall lead her, so that I will make her male, that she too may become a living spirit resembling you males. For every woman who makes herself male will enter the kingdom of heaven." Now, what is that all about? Well, you have to realize that at that time, the concept was that men were complete. They had a complete soul. The complete image of God was in men, but women had only half a soul. The feminine and woman in many traditions, including the Pythagorean, represented not permanence, but impermanence, and not deity and divinity, but mortality. And so, for example, in the sect of Dositheus, as I said before, it was said that he had 30 1/2 disciples, because one was a woman. And so here is the issue of women. Now, we're coming from a very ascetic tradition. We're coming from the tradition of Thomas. And this is not Thomas the Apostle anymore. This is the disciples of Thomas the Apostle, who have gotten very involved in Gnostic ideas and ascetic ideas. But they're saying that Jesus says that women too can enter the kingdom of heaven if they make themselves, that he will make them male. That means he will give them a complete soul. And so the concept is that women had an incomplete soul and they will make a complete soul. Now, I do not believe at all from the get-go that this is a teaching of Jesus, because Jesus' relationship with women was so different than this. He never treated women as though they had half a soul and were not worthy of this and all this kind of stuff. And that's the one way in which he really distinguished himself as different than all the other rabbis and the kind of rabbinical tradition. But here, this later anti-feminist tradition that we have puts this forward. And even though the traditions against women exist, and believe me, women were marginalized. Women's leadership in the early churches was very strong at first. We find in Paul, he talks about all the women apostles who were going around, and Mary Magdalene is the one who's in charge of the apostle John, and she's a great apostle. She's the one who discovers the resurrection and things like this. And within a century, women's roles had been completely marginalized in especially the Gentile churches, but also the Jewish churches. It simply was not something that could last in that culture. And just as even St. Paul says when he talks about the great allegory of Christ as the groom and the church as the bride, and the church needs to be subject to the groom as the bride needs to be subject to the groom, and so on. All this kind of stuff just is the world into which early Christianity went. It was a world that was not at all ready for Jesus and his teachings. But it's very clear that Mary Magdalene had a major, major role among the apostles, not just the disciples, but the apostles. And so here we see a reflection of the competitiveness that Peter felt towards Mary, and of the fact that she was, of all the women, she was the one who was considered to be the great disciple. Jesus had actually led her forward and made her male as well as female, and made her into a complete disciple, and that therefore for every woman who makes herself male will enter the kingdom of heaven. And that means, by the way, to make themselves male means to complete their souls, to gain all that was lacking. It was thought for centuries and centuries, until very recently, that if a woman was unable to bear a child, it was the woman's fault. There was something missing. But now we know it's male infertility is the cause of this. So anyway, it's a very interesting thing that in this gospel we have Mary Magdalene understood in this way. And that brings us to our next topic. Mary of Magdala and the Gospel of Mary. We have a very important piece of literature today that's called the Gospel of Mary. It's very short, it's fragmentary, but it preserves so much really important information that I've devoted an entire short seminar to the Gospel of Mary and the apostolic tradition of Mary Magdala. Now, we think of Mary of Magdalene as a repentant whore, and or a woman who had fallen upon evil ways, and Jesus cast 7 devils out of her, and blah, 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 blah. Get rid of that idea. That's not historical. That's not true. That is the way that she was marginalized, and that reputation, by the way, was put upon her in the 4th century by a certain bishop. But no, Mary of Magdala was not young enough really to be Jesus' lover, as a lot of people want her to be. She was probably about the age of Jesus' mother, or a little bit younger. And there are several ways we know that. I'm not going to discuss right now. But one thing I will say was she was the first of the apostles to die, and she died of natural causes. She was an older woman. She was probably 15, 20 years older than Jesus. And we hear about her in the Gospel of Thomas, as we've just discussed, but also in the Gospel of Philip, where she is considered to be the closest disciple, and many other sources that indicate that Mary Magdalene was, in fact, perhaps the most advanced and the closest apostle to Jesus. She was a disciple from Galilee, from the city of Magdala, and supposedly, at least the way she's described in the New Testament, which is, as I say, both anti-Semitic and, of course, anti-feministic, she's marginalized as someone, some kind of a sinner who had 7 devils cast out of her. Well, when we study what that really means, what these the daimon were and what it means, we will see that that was not an exorcism by any means. That was an initiation, very much comparable to a Hermetic initiation. So she was the first witness of the resurrection and the first who saw the risen Christ. In France, the legends, the false legends grew up that she had come to France pregnant with a child by Jesus and had delivered that child. There's all kinds of wonderful legends about this. And in the 5th century or so, the Merovingian dynasty of the Gauls claimed that they were descended from this because this legend was so ensconced, and they were long-haired conquerors, and they claimed they were descendants of Jesus through Mary Magdalene and all that sort of thing. And it wasn't until they were defeated as a dynasty by the Carolingians in the 9th and 10th centuries that they lost the power they had from just claiming that sort of thing. But if we were to discuss the fate of women disciples in church history, we're looking at a systematic marginalizing of people in the first generation to the second generation after the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus. We can find the graves of women bishops. We can find mention of them in the Acts of the Apostles and of the great women apostles who were going around. We know, of course, of the highly important part of Mary of Magdalene, and so on. But the Gospel of Mary contains information that is terrifically important about the initiation that Jesus would have transmitted to his closest disciples, initiation into the kingdom of heaven. It's very, very copacetic with what we learned from the secret Gospel of Mark. So from now on, think of Mary Magdalene as who she was. She was an extremely pious, very powerful, highly initiated, probably the most highly initiated disciple of Jesus. What Peter and James and John saw on the Mount of Transfiguration was a lower grade of initiatic experience than what Mary Magdalene had experienced. And she was not his lover. They were not sexually involved. She was involved as a supporter, and because she had the capabilities she had, which were far more psychic capabilities and far more devotional capabilities than the men apostles had, and yet it was a men's world, and so it had to go in that way. Because of that, she was the one who received undoubtedly the highest teachings from the Master. Now we're going to introduce the secret Gospel of Mark. Morton Smith, professor at Columbia University, spent a lot of time in the Greek monasteries, and especially the Marsaba monastery, way high on a cliff near what would be known as Mount Zion, which has preserved ancient manuscripts and had in its scriptorium manuscripts of great value, just like they have at Qumran, except these are Greek manuscripts that go back from the earliest church. And he went up there as a young graduate student and then spent more time going up later on, finding manuscripts with the permission of the abbot and photographing them. And on one of his journeys, he found on the back page of a page that had been written upon, and then over that had been written some other material, but under that he found a letter, which seemed to be a long fragment of a letter from Clement of Alexandria. And he went through a tremendous amount of research to demonstrate that this was written, in fact, in the style of Clement of Alexandria. We have lots and lots of writings of Clement of Alexandria. And this letter was a letter that Clement had written to clergy in Alexandria who were very upset Uh, the the name of the clergyman was Theodore, and here's what had happened. There was a homosexual sect of Christianity ruled by the teacher Carpocrates, and they had corrupted or seduced a young deacon who gave them a copy of the secret Gospel of Mark. This is the one that was not read. This is one we don't have, and it's not extant. And they had taken it and they had rewritten it in order to make it look like Jesus was a homosexual and he was doing homosexual initiations. In other words, they put their spin on it. And now it had come back to Theodore and these other people, and when they read what was in it, they were very disturbed. And so Clement wrote them to tell them that they sent it to Clement. He looked at it and he said, well, look, this is what the real secret gospel says. This is what they say. These are places where they have editorialized. This is what it really says. And he tells us a lot of very interesting stuff about that. Now I'm going to read you I'm going to read you a portion of the letter by Clement of Alexandria, because contained in that letter are corrections and quotations from this secret gospel. I strongly advise you to get a hold of this book called The Other Bible by Willis Barnstone, because you can find in the section on the Gospels, you can find one on the secret gospel and also the Gospel of the Hebrews and some of these others. But it goes like this way. From the letters of the most holy Clement, the author of the Stromatis, to Theodore. And this is the scribe copying this, is copying this letter. And now Clement is speaking to Theodore. He says, "You did well in silencing the unspeakable teachings of the Carpocratians, for these are the wandering stars referred to in the prophecy, who wander from the narrow road of the commandments into a boundless abyss of the carnal and bodily sins, blah, 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 blah. Such men are to be opposed in all ways and altogether, for even if they should say something true, one who loves the truth should not even so agree with them. For not all true things are the truth, nor should that truth which merely seems true according to human opinions be preferred to the true truth, that according to the faith. Now, of the things they keep saying about the divinely inspired gospel according to Mark, some are altogether falsifications, and others, even if they do contain some true elements, nevertheless are not reported truly. For the true things, being mixed with inventions, are falsified. We know that. We're dealing with that when we deal with the New Testament. And so that, as the saying goes, even the salt loses its savor. As for Mark, then, during Peter's stay in Rome, he wrote an account of the Lord's doings, not, however, declaring all of them, nor yet hinting at the secret ones, but selecting what he thought most useful for increasing the faith of those who were being instructed. But when Peter died a martyr, Mark came over to Alexandria, bringing both his own notes and those of Peter, from which he transferred to his former book the things suitable to whatever makes for progress toward knowledge. Thus he composed a more spiritual gospel for the use of those who were being perfected. By the way, this term being perfected is a term from the mystery religions and probably also from Kabbalah. Nevertheless, he did not divulge the things not to be uttered, nor did he write down the hierophantic teaching of the Lord. But to the stories already written he added yet others, and moreover brought in certain sayings of which he knew the interpretation would, as a mystagogue, lead the hearers into the innermost sanctuary of the truth hidden by 7 veils. Thus in sum he prepared matters, neither grudgingly nor incautiously, in my opinion, and dying he left his composition to the church in Alexandria, where it even yet is most carefully guarded, being read only to those who are being initiated into the great mysteries. But since the foul demons are always devising destruction for the race of men, Carpocrates, instructed by them in using deceitful arts, so enslaved a certain presbyter of the Church of Alexandria that he got from him a copy of the secret gospel, and then he went ahead and made all these changes. So he said to them, therefore, as I said above, one must never give way, nor when they should put forth their falsification should one concede that the secret gospel is by Mark, but should even deny it on oath. For, quote, not all true things are to be said to all men. Now, I don't know what he's quoting from, but maybe it's from Jesus. For this reason, the wisdom of God through Solomon advises, quote, answer the fool from his folly, teaching that the light of the truth should be hidden from those who are mentally blind. Again he says, quote, from him who has not shall be taken away. And, quote, let the fool walk in darkness. But we are children of light, having been illuminated by the dayspring, by the Spirit of the Lord from on high. And where the Spirit of the Lord is, it says, there is liberty, for all things are pure to the pure. To you, therefore, I shall not hesitate to answer the questions you have asked, refuting the falsifications by the very words of the gospel. And then he starts going ahead and quoting what the gospel really says in places where these other people say it says something else. So there was a lot of controversy about this, and when Morton Smith was very controversial as a scholar, but he was a good scholar and a real scholar, and a lot of people, because this was so different than things that many people had in Christianity and understood to be true, they didn't like what he had to say. I, however, agree with many scholars that this is an authentic thing and that we need to look at it, and it teaches us some very interesting things, and it teaches us many things. One of them is that there was secret tradition, there was secret teaching, especially in Alexandria, where Christianity was developed as a mystery cult, as a mystery religion, and that some of this was written down, although, as he said in Mark's Gospel, not all of it. He said he did not divulge the things not to be uttered. There are things that you are not supposed to tell, nor did he write down the hierophantic teaching of the Lord, whatever that might be. But to stories already written, he added yet others. In other words, he wrote a more spiritual gospel while he was in Alexandria. Probably the reason we don't have it today is that it got out and it got into the hands of the Carpocratians, and people denied it on oath that it was written by Mark. And that's what he tells them to do. He says, if anybody asks you if this is a true gospel, if they see it, they say, no, we never saw that. That's not authentic, and all that sort of thing. So this is a very interesting piece of literature. Well, what do we have of the secret gospel of Mark? Not a lot. The importance is that it portrays the inner circle initiatic practices of Mar Yeshua, which we're going to look at in a minute. It clarifies the so-called transfiguration on the Mount with the 3 disciples, and it shows that there's a more advanced situation than that, where one disciple is initiated, as in, for example, Hermetic initiation, which, if you're interested, I would advise you to take my seminar on the mysteries of Hermes Trismegistus. It shows that Jesus was using something that is a variation of ascent to the throne of God in the Merkaba. And there are many, many ramifications for the casting out of the 7 devils from Mary Magdalene. And as she portrays it in the Gospel of Mary, it's taking her up through 7 stages of ascent, of divine ascent. So this is the secret Gospel of Mark. This is what it looks like in Greek. This is what it looks like with the Greek actually put into Greek font so that you can see it and translate it. And I'm going to read you basically the whole thing we have from the Secret Gospel, which is a very, very short statement. And by the way, the things that he says are not authentic. He says that, and after these words follow the text in James and John came to him and all that section, but naked man with naked man and all the other things about which he wrote are not found. So obviously there's a lot of stuff in there that is kind of like homosexual stuff that he says is not in the gospel. So what is it? Well, basically all we have from this letter is that he says that after Mark 10:34, this is the actual text of the secret gospel. He says, and they came to Bethany. This woman whose brother had died was there. She came and knelt before Jesus and says to him, and this is the way Mark talks, by the way, he writes in the historic present, Son of David, have mercy on me. But the followers rebuked her. Then Jesus became angry, which, by the way, is how Mark talks all the time, and went with her into the garden where the tomb was. At once a loud voice was heard from the tomb, and Jesus went up and rolled the stone away from the door of the tomb, and at once he went in where the youth was. He reached out his hand and took him by the hand and raised him up. The youth looked at Jesus and loved him and began to beg him to be with him. Then they left the tomb and went to the youth's house, for he was rich. 6 days later, Jesus told him what to do. And in the evening the youth comes to him wearing a linen shroud over his naked body. He stayed with him that night, for Jesus was teaching him the mystery of the kingdom of God. And from there he got up and returned to the other side of the Jordan. And, well, what's important about this? Well, the word that is used to describe the youth is a word that's used in the mystery cults of a person who is being initiated into the highest form of the mysteries. The second thing is important is that it's an all-night thing. It's with a white robe, and it's teaching the mysteries of the kingdom, and it's done one-to-one. Now, we have no description in the exoteric New Testament of Jesus working one-to-one with anybody except possibly with Mary Magdalene. So what we have here is evidence of traditions, of inner traditions, of an apostolic gnosis, of things that don't get passed on into white bread Christianity. So we have story here of Jesus initiating a person into the mysteries of the kingdom. Now you can see how Carpocrates could take this and turn this into some kind of a homosexual thing and all this kind of stuff, but that is not what it was, and that is not what Jesus did. So there's a great study about this. There are whole books written about this, studying every word of it and to try to get all kinds of meaning out of it, and there is a lot of meaning you can get. I'm just introducing you to it, and the whole point of this is to introduce you to the idea that there is also esoteric material in the teachings of Jesus, but we don't have it in a real obvious way. So we can make some conclusions here. First of all, the historical teachings of Jesus are embedded in both the canonical and the non-canonical early Christian literature. And there's a lot of material that's not in the New Testament now that's even earlier and just as authentic. And it's well for you to read that. Read the Apostolic Fathers. Read the letters of Polycarp and Ignatius of Antioch and Clement of Rome, and read the Shepherd of Hermas and the Didache of the 12 Apostles. Find this collected among the Apostolic Fathers. You should read this. This is earlier than a lot of the New Testament. Give you real insight into the formation of Gentile Christianity and the Gentile churches. Second, there is knowledge required to recover these historical teachings that are embedded in all this. We have to understand the modalities of oral and literary transmission, and we've been introduced to that concept and the fact that these things exist in this module. So we understood that there are some things that can be carried down orally much better than other things. But we also have to learn something about the Aramaic terminology used by Jesus, his vocabulary, the vocabulary of his teachings. There's a whole vocabulary that goes along with this. And what does it mean? We looked at a little of it. We looked at the Amen word, which means fidelity, faithfulness, not belief, faith, and some other words. Well, there's a lot more of that kind of stuff we need to look at. We also need to look at the teachings of Jesus in the context of their background in the Jewish mysticism that was the matrix in which this all developed. And so we have to learn a little bit more about this. And we do need to do some practice with this and do some examples before we can become hermeneutically proficient to do this. And all this stuff we're going to do in the next modules, next few modules, we're going to work through these details. And how are you going to apply this sort of stuff? Well, first of all, if you're studying for the Bachelor of Divinity degree or working in our ordination program, you're going to be able to apply this to your interpretation or your hermeneutics of the New Testament. You'll be able to understand much better and get at the authentic teachings of Jesus in the New Testament and understand how to find them, how to extract them, and how to interpret them. And the second thing is you're going to get a far, far deeper spiritual understanding of the teachings of Jesus, which have to be the foundation for discipleship, not church dogma and theology, and not the mores of your country or the spin on somebody's denominational form of religion, but you're going to gain a discipleship with a universal spirituality of the sort taught by the Master Jesus.